Yeah.
I do too.
Archiving started.
But notice I was about to start without it. So I'm shutting my talk off. You can lock your talk on, and anybody who has any questions, type them in the chat, and we'll open up the talk at the end.
Okay. All right, and everybody can hear me all right? Okay, I just want to make sure everyone can hear me. Beautiful. Okay, first of all, thanks for the introduction there, Dr. Baggio. Really appreciate it. This has been a really good course, actually a real good set of courses for me. And I just want to give everybody a single caution here. I have friends and coworkers with great senses of humor and good times, but I want you to know my father is on the line right now. So if anybody acts up, I'm telling, okay? But that's about it. So again, thank you, Bobby. And I'd like to also welcome all of you to the webinar. I appreciate you joining in and hope you find it worthwhile. And so now let's move a little bit ahead to the next slide, where Bobby asked me to put this in. So this is basically my credentials for whatever they might be worth. I've worked in commercials, corporate videos, training. Got my master's in education a long time ago. Also thank my father for that. Taught advanced business writing at Penn State, and right now I'm at LaSalle pursuing a certificate in ITM, Instructional Technology Management. So with that said, let's move on. Okay. Welcome to how using storytelling techniques could lead to more effective training and presentation. All right, here's the situation. Consider this. You have a skill, a knowledge base, certain expertise that makes you good at what you do. And now your company or your client wants you to teach others how to do what you already know well. It's flattering for a second, and then almost instantly, some mild form of panic sets in. So all of a sudden you're wondering, how do you present what you know? How do you structure the training? How do you keep the group's interest? And where do you start? For most of us, the search for these answers begins and ends with one question, which is, what's been done before? And so, strong in our sense of tradition and habit, we open up a PowerPoint template, gather up our data, and rush back to the same methodology that's been ingrained into us since elementary school. And what's that protocol? Well, you probably remember it well. Look ahead here. Topic sentence, support points, summation. Or to put it in the terminology of the business world, you know how it goes. Tell them what you're going to tell them again, and tell them what you told them. I mean, why not? Those guidelines are safe. They're rooted in business and educational tradition. And if you've ever been on the receiving end of one of these presentations, well, you see here, you know, well, as you see on the next slide, you know they almost never hold your interest. And the problem with that is not just that it's boring. As you see here on the next slide, the real issue is that the much more critical problem is a training session in which learners aren't paying attention cannot, by definition, produce effective behavior change. Really, that's the whole purpose of training, to teach people new behaviors they can use to improve performance. Let's talk about that goal. According to ASTD, the American Society of Training and Development, and one of the worst acronymed organizations in the known world, this is the mission of training: to empower professionals to develop knowledge and skills successfully. That's a laudable goal, but it raises the question, how do you measure successful? Well, for the purposes of this presentation, we'll define successful in terms of helping attendees achieve the following goal, which you see on the next slide. That goal is to help participants achieve a level of performance in the targeted behavior that's better than their current performance. And think about it. This is the reason companies invest in training. If trainees were already performing at an acceptable level in a particular area, there'd be no need to train them. The firm's money could be better allocated elsewhere. But since the goal of training is to have learners improve on the status quo, the task facing you, the trainer or the presenter, is easy to express, but it's kind of difficult to achieve. So what is the challenge that you need to achieve? It's this. How do you design training and presentations that result in learners doing better? And likewise, how do you create a presentation that really resonates with your audience? Peter Guber, author of Tell to Win, Connect, Persuade, and Triumph with the Hidden Power of Story, says that, as you see here, especially in business, you've got to provide an emotionally propelled vehicle to communicate information to people. Why should he know this? Well, as the studio chief of Columbia Pictures, chairman and CEO of Sony Pictures, and chairman and CEO of Mandalay Entertainment Group, Mr. Guber's job has been to persuade investors and producers to invest millions of dollars in movie concepts long before a single frame is filmed. In other words, he gets people to invest in things that don't exist yet. So maybe he knows something about persuasion. Guber also makes the point that a significant amount of research shows that most of us make our decisions in an emotional manner, but then find an intellectual alibi to justify them. As you see here, what that really comes down to is that emotions are stronger than logic. But if that's true, why are most educational and business presentations so devoid of emotion? Well, Guber has a theory that our schools and workplaces, by their very nature, oppose emotion. His point, our culture has a, quote, dominant assumption that hard business decisions are governed exclusively by numbers, tactics, concepts, and raw data, the hard stuff. We see here it's been this way for a while. Philosophers since Plato have taught us that emotions, or as he called them, the passions, need to be harnessed because they're unruly forces that we have to suppress if we want to think clearly. Because reason is supposed to be the supreme expression of higher consciousness. It didn't take long for educational systems to adopt this model. As we see here, the educational systems adopted this model, even though the oral tradition, shown here by the Arabian Nights, of educating through stories, dates back to long before the invention of written language. Still, there's little question that the educational system we all grew up with puts a premium on intellectual reasoning at the expense of emotion. Now, why do you think this is? So let's take a little bit of time, and if you can use the little chat box there, what is your theory as to why schools and presentations in business are more about emotion, are more about facts and figures than about emotion? Give you a minute or two to put in something there. Less time, legal implications. Paul's using an acronym there too. Okay. All right. Difficult to quantify emotions. Interesting. People want to make decisions based on logic, executive preference, factual. Okay, Bobby, I'll use you to, okay, very good. Those are all very valid theories. I've got one myself, which is that the emotionalist approach gained acceptance because when you take emotion out of any subject matter, it becomes less messy and unpredictable, and therefore easier to control. Okay, as we see here, training guru Peter Drucker put it, if it doesn't get measured, it doesn't get managed. Of course, there's also the factor we talked about earlier, which is that people tend to follow the path with which they're most familiar. That brings us back to the way nearly all of us learned how to present back in school. You remember this. In the classroom, it was abundantly clear that the students who received the highest grades for their reports were the ones who pleased the teacher by demonstrating how much they knew. But in training and presentations, that model of showing that you did all your homework is actually pretty inappropriate. That's for a very good reason. In school, our work as students was greeted by someone who knew more about the subject than we did, namely the teacher. But in training and presentations, we're talking to people who know less than we do, whether they're kids, teenagers, college students, or adults. And that idea is a 180-degree change from the teacher model. So the issue isn't how much we as trainers know. It's how much the audience, as people new to the information we're bringing them, are able to take what they're learning from us and apply it to their work. And that's why we need a very different way to present instruction. Here's the question. Is there a more effective way for trainers to move people to do things differently? Well, the point hopefully being made here today is that a goal of that nature falls squarely in the realm of storytelling. Now, I have to provide a little word of warning here. There's a certain danger to using the word storytelling in a business and training context. Although its principles have been used throughout history to convey messages that move people to action, well, there's something about the word story that instantly brings to mind fanciful tales, dubious excuses, and making things up as you go along. Who knows? It may even be worthwhile in the business world for storytelling to go by another name altogether, perhaps one with a little less fantastical of a connotation, maybe envisioning or situation-based presentations. But for now and today, we're going to use the word storytelling. Okay, so what is a story? First, let's look at what they're not. Quote Mr. Goober again, stories are not lists, decks, PowerPoints, flip charts, lectures, pleas, instructions, regulations, manifestos, calculations, lesson plans, threats, statistics, evidence, orders, or raw facts. Got all that? Rather, stories have a unique power to move people's hearts, minds, feet, and wallets in the storyteller's intended direction. Examples of this basic truth are countless. The Bible, no matter your religion, is not just a collection of commandments, a collection of stories that demonstrate how one should live. When Dr. Martin Luther King changed our nation's definition of civil rights, he didn't use facts and figures. He shared a dream. And when candidates run for office, the successful ones are usually the ones who tell their stories, the stories of their constituents, more dramatically and empathetically than their opponent. In other words, information defines, stories persuade. The goal of training and presentations is to persuade your audience to adopt new ways of doing things. But how can any of us tell a story if we don't know how to create one? Well, it's simpler than you think. And you're going to see how to do it right now. Up on the screen, you see the conventional presentation model. Some presentations may have more support statements in the middle, but basically it's the same technique we all learned in elementary and school and junior high. Tell them what you're going to say, tell it to them in greater detail, and then tell them what you told them. But that's not a story. Here's how to tell a story. You set up the current situation for your main character, give them a goal to reach, reveal the challenge to that goal, and then have that main character learn a new way of thinking and doing in order to triumph over whatever was challenging them in order to achieve that goal. That's it. It's really that simple. You've just seen exactly what you're going to get out of the next 30 minutes. From this point forward, everything you hear and learn will in some way be about the right-hand side of this slide. Okay, so now that I've given away the ending, can we keep this thing interesting and intriguing? Well, let's see how the story unfolds. Storytelling model always begins with the situation that defines the status quo, how things are at the point the reader enters the story. For example, here are 4 classic movies: Wizard of Oz, Star Wars, Casablanca, and Goodfellas. Using the little text box on the lower left of your screen, type in what you see as the opening situation in any of these movies. By the way, you don't have to type in the name of the movie. If you say Rick or Bogart, we'll know you're not talking about The Wizard of Oz. All right, so go ahead. Let's see what you considered the opening situation in each of these. Dorothy's home life. Dissatisfaction. Deep thought. Dorothy having an issue with her neighbor due to biting dog. I read that headline. All right. Okay. Very good. We're looking at a young man longing for something different. Right. And these are all these are very good answers, and they're all very accurate, and they're all sort of getting at the metaphorical experience, which is good. They're all facing change and hardships. But do they know it yet? Okay. So to just take all that and go into a little bit of a summation, in The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy's in Kansas dreaming of life over the rainbow. In Star Wars, young Luke Skywalker is on Tatooine being watched over by Obi-Wan Kenobi. In Casablanca, Rick is lurking sullenly in his cabaret and he's indifferent to the war. And in Goodfellas, well, Henry Hill is a young kid and he's enthralled by gangster life. So that's the point where they're all going to grow from the point of view of the story. Or actually, in the case of Goodfellas, it's where the main character doesn't really grow. Usually that lack of change is the foundation of a tragedy. Okay. Now how about in training or in a presentation? In those cases, the opening situation is the status where each learner is at as it relates to the topic in which they're about to receive instruction or where they're about to learn something new. There are numerous ways that a trainer can get his or her learners to get in touch with their current situation. And here on this next slide, you see a list of possible ways to do that. You can give assessment tests, self-evaluations, maybe a parallel example with the profile of a fictional worker or student in the same situation. You can do case studies. You can provide an internal or external report that describes the state the organization is in. You can start it with a customer complaint. You can start it with a market condition, why this training is necessary, or a description of a relevant internal or market need for what you're about to introduce. In other words, you started off by establishing the current situation. And one of the most important requirements of the current situation step is that the main character has to be introduced. The job of the main character is to reflect the audience. To quote famed movie director Barry Levinson, the hero of the story is the character who makes the hard decisions and actually feels meaningful change happen within himself. With that in mind, do you know who the hero of this presentation is? Well, it's not me. It's not Dr. Baggio. It's you. You're the one who decided to attend this webinar because you wanted to learn a possible new way to achieve the goal of delivering more effective training or of delivering a better presentation. Or you might have done it just to please me, but thanks for that. That means the change that's going to happen here, hopefully, will be to you. Okay, so what's the point there? Well, the same concept applies when you're giving a presentation. But in that case, the main characters and heroes of your story will be your audience. They're the ones whose current situation needs to change. They're the ones who arrived on the scene with the promise of learning a new way to improve their status quo. But how will things be better for them if they actually improve on the way things are now? That's described in the next thrilling chapter of our storytelling sequence, Step 2, Establish the Goal. As human beings, we innately seek meaning and purpose. And that isn't just a philosophy. Scientific research supports the claim. For example, Drs. Travis Poole and Stephen J. Hine proposed that, quote, people naturally assemble mental representations of expected associations which organize their beliefs and perceptions. And that provides them with a general feeling that their lives make sense. So, this is an actual PowerPoint slide you're looking at right now. And if we inherently need to make sense of our environment, maybe that explains why it's not helpful for us to view a cascade of bullet points on a screen, or why it's difficult to follow a set of instructions without knowing what their end purpose is. And that is where the storytelling format can help. Let's go back on this next slide to our movies. Very shortly after the main character is introduced, that person always encounters something they're yearning for or striving to achieve. And that's the goal, the purpose that propels the story. So using our previous movie examples, let's see if we can identify the goal of the main characters in each of them. Okay, your turn to participate again. Type in what you think the goal is for the main character in any of these movies. We'll just take a minute or two to do that. Whoops. Okay, guys, are doing good. Okay. Hey, Bobby? Bobby?
Yeah, I'm here.
Are you, typing a lot?
No, I'm not, but somebody is. I was just about to hop in there, Art, and say, folks, if you're typing, make sure that your speakers are turned down and that your microphone is not picking that up, because we can all hear you. I have the audio disabled, so I'm not sure why that's coming through. But just, try to type quietly here because we have 60 people in here. So, all right.
All right. So sorry that got a little off there, but right, these are the kind of answers that talk about people's goals. All right. And just to summarize it, in The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy's goal is simply to get back home. In Star Wars, Luke Skywalker wants to defeat Darth Vader. In Casablanca, Rick's goal really is to find out why Ilsa left him at the train station. And in Goodfellas, Henry Hill is propelled by the desire to be a big-time gangster. And basically, to know the goal of the story, you just have to ask yourself the question you see on this next slide. What is the main character's reason for being? Or, what's the main character obsessed with accomplishing? It's really that basic. Okay, moving on. In training, it's pretty simple too. The goal you need to communicate is the reason the training session or presentation is being held. In short, it's a thing that attendees should be better at when they leave the session. For that reason, it's very important that you make two things extremely clear to your audience from the outset. One, you need to tell them how their work life will be better after they apply what they're learning to their jobs, or their lives, as the case may be. And two, you need to explain how the overall organization will be better after everyone applies what they're learning from you to their work. This gives your audience something to aspire to. It presents that goal both in terms of what's in it for me, as well as in terms of the benefit to their overall community of coworkers. In other words, stating the goal and its benefits right at the beginning provides relevancy, purpose, and meaning. So let's move on to the next slide and see about putting this to the test. Type your answers into the answer block to these questions. Number one, how can this webinar make your work life better? And two, how could it make your organization better? Okay? Let's see if anybody has an answer to that. Make my trainings more engaging. All right? Anyone else? All right. Gives me ideas for better content. Good. All right. Makes presentations more inviting. There we go. Improve compliance training. There you go. That idea of connecting people, which Bill just wrote there, that's really a lot of what we're looking for. Another term like that, engage my coworkers. Good. All right. I feel like people have a reason for being here. That's great. That's great. All right. Organize your thoughts and flow. Let's move on to the next slide. So is a goal the same thing as a learning objective? Many professionals in the training industry refer to the goal-setting concept as learning objectives, and they come right up front, much like a goal does. There is a similarity, but true to form for business and educational communications, well, it lacks the emotional pull that a good story provides. Learning objectives tell you what you'll get done, but establishing the goal in a story tells you how your life will be better once that goal is achieved. Also, learning objectives are usually about gathering knowledge, whereas storytelling is about acquiring tools. We'll get into that a little later. But for now, let's keep our focus on goals. As we've mentioned, goals create a sense of purpose and meaning. Along the same lines, stories help satisfy our innate quest for meaning. Why do I say innate? Well, it's because seeking out purpose and meaning in our lives is really part of our natural makeup. There have actually been scientific experiments done on how stories help satisfy a basic human need for purpose. Guided by the constructionist theory that people search for meaning even when there isn't any there, Drs. Arthur Gracer, Mary Singer, and Tom Trabasso, not shown here, noted a strong difference between how people respond to narrative text versus expository text. Incidentally, they defined expository text, and this is interesting, as, among other things, data lists, manuals, and technical writing. Think how much of training and presentations is devoted to that. Simply put, their findings showed that people become more engaged with stories than with lists. Okay, and as we see on this next slide, how did they evaluate engagement? By seeing which kind of writing led their subjects to create more inferences. In other words, predictions of what would come next. To test their theory, Gresser's team presented subjects with pairs of words, this is just part of the test, that were sometimes related and sometimes unrelated. What did the readers do in this situation? They attempted to create meaning where none existed. Now, there is a relationship here from fish to ocean. Maybe wrench to refrigerator, phone to popsicle, none. But I wouldn't be surprised if most people here are trying to draw some link between the words of the same color. So basically, just like us, the people in these experiments attempted to create meaning where none existed. They imposed patterns and relationships that they would make up on their own. But once the subjects began to find out that there wasn't any real pattern or predictability of meaning or any kind of storyline, they began to lose interest. Or, see on this next slide, as screenwriter Joe Mankiewicz, famous for All About Eve and The Barefoot Contessa, put it, the difference between life and the movies is a script has to make sense, and life doesn't. Okay, so how ingrained is our need to make sense of the world? Well, there have been neuron-based scientific studies designed to track how the brain processes information. And those experiments show that our minds naturally attempt to sort nonsense into meaningful chunks. If we can't find those connections, our minds start to wander away from the information in front of us. We begin to search our long-term memories for how that new piece of information fits into the situation we're currently facing. In other words, if something doesn't make sense to us right away, we start searching our mental back files to give it a place to land until it either makes sense or we just let it go. Unfortunately, that takes us away from the subject matter because we are literally drifting off to another place. Chris Sanderson, editor-in-chief of Wired magazine, sums up the situation like this. The tragedy of our species is that we're wired for narrative, yet live in a world that's random. Likewise, in his best-selling book, Brain Rules, molecular biologist John Medina takes this quest for meaning and focuses the blame directly on today's highly detailed, data-heavy, storyless, PowerPoint presentations. Next slide, we're looking at a saber-toothed tiger. And here's where Medina takes us back to our primitive selves. His statement, our brains were formed to see the big picture. When primitive man saw a saber-toothed tiger, he asked himself, will it eat me? And not, how many teeth does it have? It may seem like a bit of a leap, but that instinct for survival may also be where we get one of the most critical elements of storytelling. That's drama. According to scriptwriting authority Robert McKee, drama is built on contradictions and contrasts. For example, the big scary prehistoric tiger and the little caveman. But in training and presentations, what stands in contrast to the goal? Next slide. That's the next step in our storytelling framework. Step 3, define the challenge. Take, for example, our 4 movies again. Each one of them revolves around a central conflict. What this means is that when you're presenting your training or presentation in story form, you have to have an opposing force that gets in the way of the main character and makes his or her goal difficult to obtain. Okay, now it's your turn again. Who or what is the opposing force in each of these classic films? See what answers come up in the little block here. The Empire. The Wicked Witch. Right. Nazis and corruption for Casablanca. That's right. Usually in a really good story, the villain is really, really well defined. And like we said in The Wizard of Oz, it's the Wicked Witch because she wants the shoes that Dorothy needs to get back home. In Star Wars, it's the dark side, Darth Vader. In Casablanca, well, there's a couple. Rick's nemesis is Major Strasser of the Nazis, but Sidney Greenstreet is also an opposing force in that he had the passports. And in Goodfellas, well, it's a little more complicated. Henry Hill's climb to mob success is continually thwarted by his own and his friends' destructive tendencies. Let's move on a bit. Is it even plausible to have an opposing force in a business training session or presentation? Well, to answer that question, we'll turn to one of the greatest presenters in history, the late Steve Jobs. Author Carmen Gallo, in his book, The Presentation Secrets of Steve Jobs, notes that the Apple chairman always used a villain in his famed keynote speeches to his faithful employees. Consider this description of the launch of the Macintosh in 1984. Okay? Some of you might remember this commercial. In every classic story, the hero fights the villain. The same storytelling outline applies to world-class presentations. I'm quoting Jobs' biographer here. Steve Jobs establishes the foundation of a persuasive story by introducing his audience to an antagonist, an enemy, a problem in need of a solution. In the 1984 commercial, the enemy was Big Blue, IBM. And a little further on, Gallo uses a mid-1980s quote from Jobs himself to paint the image of the villain that Jobs considered to be Apple's real opposing force. You see that on the next slide. As Jobs himself said, man is the creator of change in this world, and as such, he should be above systems and structures and not subordinate to them. In other words, the opposing force doesn't always have to be the competition or even a person, even though in the 1984 Apple versus IBM example, it was a major corporation. Okay, well, let's move on to the next slide and talk about some things that maybe we face in training and presentations. As you see here, there's concepts to promote. Deanne, I think, mentioned compliance rules before. So what's the opposing force to that? Well, the previous ways we've been working. If you have to talk about safety guidelines, the opposing force is going to be the drive to get the job done quickly. If you're presenting a new sales model, well, then you're going to have to go up against familiarity with existing sales techniques. Retirement planning, well, people have to pay for their current expenses. New technology, people are comfortable with what they're doing now. And security protocols, well, people probably perceive that what they do now is freedom enough. So what comes next? In his analysis of Steve Jobs' presentation strategy, Carmen Gallo said that once the challenge has presented itself as real and formidable, that's when the heroic new product should be demonstrated in action. To quote, after identifying the villain and introducing the hero, the next step in the Apple narrative is to show how the hero clearly offers the victim, namely the consumer, an escape from the villain's grip. Okay, that might be pretty dramatic technique for unveiling a new product or new idea, but will it work in a training situation? Remember, it's a trainee or the audience member who's the hero. So in this case, something different has to take place, and the solution can be found in the storytelling framework. That takes us to step 4. Present the new model. Well, if there's one consistency across the varied literature on storytelling, it's that you can't have a story unless you have a character arc. The character has to change, just like George McFly did in Back to the Future. Okay, on this next slide, we see another example of what we go through. Here we have Kenneth Branagh's Hamlet. And the point here is that the hero must go through some kind of experience that profoundly changes his or her way of seeing and doing things. And it's that new perspective and new set of tools that give the character the power to meet the challenge presented by the opposing force and ultimately reach the desired goal. In tragedies, that goal is obtained at too great a cost. But in feel-good stories, the original goal is either attained or often put aside in favor of an even greater goal. For example, take Rocky. Rocky Balboa's goal is not to win the fight. Instead, it's to display the character and hard work it takes to go for 15 rounds with Apollo Creed, the champion of the world. In other words, his goal isn't to be victorious. It's to not back down or to go the distance. Okay. Next, we see that there's something that's required of every hero and a good story, which is to gain the understanding that his or her old way of doing things will no longer meet the challenge. And so, he or she must adapt to and learn a new and better way to get the job done. And that, just to make things clear, is why this step is called present the new model. Now, of course, you could argue that in the story we're looking at here, the smart little pig knew what to do all along. But as readers, we learn from our observation that the easier, less labor-intensive way of doing things, namely straw and sticks, didn't work. So we relied on the third little pig to show us the new model. Okay? Let's think about this for a second. What are the new behaviors or new tools that our main characters either learn to use or not use in each of our 4 examples? Okay, your turn again. What is the new thing that took place, the new model of learning that happened with each of these characters? Okay, Ken said, right. Luke, you learned to use the Force. Ed has that there's no place like home. Dorothy gathered friendships. That's right. It's all about getting the shoes, much as the rest of life is. Right. Dorothy learned she had the power the whole time. Power within, very dramatic there. Okay? Right. John, you're right. He bangs around with gangsters. Yep. Sacrifice is a big story in Casablanca. Rick forgives and rejoins the world. What you see is all these people, all these main characters, learned that they either had something inside them or learned something outside them that made them approach life and learn it in a different way. And the only way they could do that was by what they learned. Back to the point in Goodfellas, which does not have a happy ending, Henry Hill doesn't change his ways and ultimately winds up, to quote the words in the movies, living like a schnook. Okay, let's move on. In most stories, the acquiring of a new perspective and new tools is the longest part of the book or movie. As you might remember from It's a Wonderful Life, shown here, the main character must go through experience after experience and encounter situation after situation. And each event plays a small part in reshaping their changing view of the world, while also honing and preparing them for the climactic challenge. Put it simply, the hero is not just the person who saves the day. Rather, it's the person who learns to save the day. That important distinction drives home one of the fundamental similarities between effective training and storytelling. Parallel to instructional design is that in training, learners acquire new and better ways to achieve their goals. And that represents a change from their old way of doing things and a switch to something more effective. Okay? Next slide. So much like in a story or a movie, that new tool must be put to the test in one example after another until the hero, that is the trainee, is ready to take his or her learning out into the real world and take on the real challenge. In the movies, by the way, this is most commonly shown in a montage sequence. We watch as the hero or heroine gets better and better at whatever they have to be good at, which sometimes can involve an awful lot of sanding the fence and waxing the fence. At first, in most stories, like in most training sessions, the main character doesn't really grasp why he or she has to go through all this practice, pain, and testing, even though the mentor usually makes it clear right from the start. But eventually, that reason's realized. And that brings us to what you see in front of you here now. Step 5, experience triumph. This is when the hero takes the new tools and knowledge he or she has gained and uses them in a triumphant battle against the opposing force. In many stories, this is represented as a battle between the forces of good and the forces of evil. In others, it's a one-on-one confrontation. In feel-good stories, the hero or heroine wins. Not always the contest, but definitely a sense of themselves as a better person. In tragedies, when it comes time for this ultimate test, the hero succumbs to the opposing force. And in a few examples, such as romantic comedies, the two opposing sides join together. And now, as you see on this next slide, when there is a triumph, usually there's even an awards ceremony. Think about how many movies you've seen where the main characters earn some kind of badge of honor for their efforts, be it receiving a medal, gaining applause and acclaim, winning another's appreciation or love, or becoming the new leader. In training situations, it's pretty much the same. Triumph occurs when the trainees are confident in their newfound abilities and eager to pursue the goals set out for them at the beginning of the session. This, too, is often marked by awards, certificates, and acclaim. But the most important achievement is the new abilities and confidence the learners now have at their disposal to meet the coming challenges. If that combination of skill, willingness, and self-belief is achieved, then the story will be complete. The stage will be set for the start of a beautiful new beginning. And thank you very much. So, as you see on the next slide, there you go. Any questions, comments, you want your money back, just let me know. But here we go. Bobby, I'll let you take over from here.
All right. First of all, let's have a big round of applause here for Art. I thought that was a great presentation. I'm going to open it up for questions. I'm going to hit the archive button. We have about 8 minutes here. So let's get some conversation going. I thought, one of Art's desires when he did this is he wanted to use a story to tell a story. And I think he did a fabulous job accomplishing that. Yeah, Cass, I agree. It was really wonderful. All right, so let me hit the archive button, and then we'll check the chat here. Questions, folks, comments, and with Art's sense of humor, of course, the next question is a request for refunds, which would be, we'd give you the check in the mail here.
Exactly.